2013-14 Marshall lectures. This will again go on for approximately an hour, and apart from a short introduction, will then be followed by a half an hour question and answer session when will be very pleased to take the questions and answer them. So, I think without more ado,
thank you. Okay, so today I want to talk to you about, yesterday I talked to you about some markets that operate a little differently than markets you might be familiar with. And today I want to talk to you about some really different markets. In particular, I want to tell you about kidneys. So, the nature of economic engineering is I'm going to tell you about kidneys in a way that really depends on knowing something about kidneys. So let me start off and tell you a bit about kidneys, more than you would normally expect to know in an economics lecture, and then we'll see where the economics comes in. So just incidentally, market design is an outward-facing part of economics. So I'm going to be drawing from a bunch of papers today. Many of them are in economics journals, like the Journal of Economic Theory or the Quarterly Journal of Economics, but many of them are in surgery journals, like the American Journal of Transplantation or the New England Journal of Medicine. So part of this discussion that goes on in order to actually make a market happen is you have to figure out what's going on and talk to your colleagues about that, and you have to talk to the people who are going to implement the market. So the way to think about this is we're helping the surgeons do something that they want to do. But of course, we have to have lots of discussions. We learn a lot from them. Some of the heroes of this story, who I'll tell you about, are surgeons. So the background of kidney exchange is that there's a big shortage of organs for transplantation in the United States and in Britain. So in the United States today, there are about 100,000 people waiting for a deceased donor kidney. And the wait can be long. We do about 11,000 deceased donor transplants a year. Many people die while waiting. It's a costly process to wait. You have a similar story here in the United Kingdom. You've got about, when I checked earlier this week, you had about 6,000 people on the waiting list for deceased donor kidneys. You only get to do about 1,700, 1,800 transplants a year, so the wait here is very long too. But kidneys are an unusual organ for transplantation because they don't have to come from dead people. You each have 2 kidneys, and if you're as healthy as I hope that you are, you could remain healthy with 1 kidney. And what that means is if someone you knew needed a kidney, was dying of kidney failure, you could give them a kidney. You might be able to give them a kidney. And in the UK, last year, or in the 14 months ending in April, there were almost 1,000 living donor kidneys. Now, notice that there are, in the UK and in the US, there are now more living donors than there are deceased donors. There are fewer transplanted kidneys from living donors because deceased donors give both their kidneys, and living donors just give 1. But the modal donor in the US and the UK is a living donor. But sometimes you're healthy enough to give a kidney, but you can't give it to the person you love. And that's what gives rise to kidney exchange, because sometimes you would like to give a kidney to someone you love, and I'd like to give a kidney to someone I love. Neither of us can do so for reasons of compatibility, but I could give to your patient and you could give to my patient. So a kidney exchange is a transaction. It's a kind of transaction that economists are familiar with. It's an exchange. And here's a very simple example where there's pair 1, a donor-recipient pair, a patient-donor pair, I'll say later. They have incompatible blood types. Here's another patient-donor pair who have incompatible blood types, but they could do an exchange. The blood type B kidney could go to the blood type B patient, and the blood type A kidney could go to the blood type A patient. Now, notice that this is an in-kind exchange. There's no money changing hands. It's a problem in barter. And William Stanley Jevons famously wrote about barter, that the reason we don't see lots of barter is it's hard to do. You have to find a double coincidence of wants. To successfully engage in barter, you have to find someone who has what you want and who wants what you have. And that's hard to do. And so Jevons proposed that money is a market design invention to get around the difficulty of barter. When there's money in the market, you can buy what you want from who has it without having to have what they want. But in the United States, it's illegal to buy and sell kidneys for money. Here's a sentence from the National Organ Transplant Act of 1984, which says it shall be unlawful for any person to knowingly acquire, receive, or otherwise transfer any human organ for valuable consideration for use in human transplantation. So it's not quite clear what that phrase, valuable consideration, means, but for sure it means that in the United States you cannot buy and sell kidneys for transplantation. So the second part of my talk today is going to be about repugnant transactions, transactions that some people want to engage in and other people don't think they should engage in, and that are often therefore against the law. So here in Britain, you have the UK Human Tissue Act of 2004, and it says, prohibition of commercial dealings. A person commits an offense, here in the UK, if he gives or receives a reward for the supply of, or for an offer to supply, any controlled material. And this is the Human Tissue Act, so the controlled materials are human organs. So in the UK, you can't give a reward. In the United States, you can't give valuable consideration. You might think that this exchange violates the law. It looks like something is being given for something. A reward is being given, consideration is being given, a kidney is being given for a kidney. The Department of Justice wouldn't write us a memo saying that kidney exchange was legal under the terms of the National Organ Transplant Act. So eventually Congress passed an amendment to the act which says the preceding sentence, this sentence, does not apply to kidney exchange. Okay, so that's how we got around it in the United States. I don't know how you got around it in England, but you're doing kidney exchange here too. I'll tell you about that. So the intent of the law was to stop the buying and selling of kidneys, not to stop transplantation of living donor kidneys, possibly through exchange, so that people who couldn't otherwise get living donor kidneys could get them, could get compatible kidneys. So let me tell you a little bit about an exchange and what goes on. So here are a couple of pictures of surgery. I'm the man in the yellow gown, keeping my hands out of the way so no one hands me anything. There's a kidney in that bucket that's being prepared for transplantation into this man. These two pictures are taken in Cincinnati, Ohio. Not in the picture, but right behind me in this picture is another operating room in which the nephrectomy, the donor, removing the kidney from the donor, has just taken place. And here it is going into someone in Cincinnati. Now, she isn't his donor, she's the donor with another patient. That other patient and his donor are in Toledo, Ohio, a city not far away at a hospital where my colleague Mike Reese is doing the surgery. And they do these surgeries simultaneously, by which I mean they anesthetize the patient, they make the initial incisions, then they get on their cell phones in the operating room and they say, we're good to go here in Cincinnati, are you good to go in Toledo? And when they're told that everything is ready in Toledo, then both nephrectomies happen simultaneously. And that's because you can't give valuable consideration for an organ for human transplantation. That means you can't write a contract that says, we'll give you a kidney today and you give us a kidney tomorrow. That's consideration. Consideration is legal word for contracts. So you can't write a contract. One way to make sure that both sides go through is to do it simultaneously. But that causes congestion. Remember we talked about congestion yesterday, about how in a market it's hard to evaluate and do all the transactions you'd like to. Well, it causes congestion because to do a simple exchange, the simplest one between two incompatible patient-donor pairs, it turns out you need 4 operating rooms and 4 surgical teams because you have to do 2 nephrectomies and 2 transplants. So it's not impossible to arrange those. Indeed, when you do a single living transplant, if these patients were compatible, then each hospital would need 2 operating rooms, one for the nephrectomy and one for the transplant, and 2 surgical teams. So each hospital isn't being asked for this simple exchange to produce more resources than it would if they were doing an ordinary transplant, but they have to coordinate them. They have to do them at the same time. Now, we'd like to remember Jevons telling us about the difficulty of barter. It's because of the double coincidence of wants that's hard to find. So it would be good if we didn't have to look for a double coincidence. There might be some patients who can't find a double coincidence, but who could be involved in a longer cycle like this among 3 pairs. Right? So here are 3 pairs, and it turns out donor 1 can give to recipient 2, and donor 2 can give to recipient 3, and donor 3 can give to recipient 1. But no 2 of them could give to each other. So this is a little caricature of what our data sets are going to look like when I show them to you. That is, it's a compatibility graph. Each pair is represented in a node, and there's an arrow going from one pair to another if the kidney can go that way, from the donor in the first pair to the patient in the second pair. And so here's a three-way exchange. To do it would take 6 operating rooms and 6 surgical teams. When we started off doing kidney exchange, we initially proposed an ambitious proposal, and when we started to talk to our surgical colleagues, they said, forget it. It's really hard. It'll be really hard for us to do even two-way exchanges. If you want to help us out, tell us how to organize two-way exchanges, simple two-way ones. So we did that, and that's how kidney exchange started in the United States. But eventually we talked about how the benefits of being able to do larger exchanges would largely be captured if you could do even exchanges of size 3. And so the logistics were developed and the coordination was developed so that we can do size 3 kidney exchanges in the United States at most of the hospitals that participate. And you can do that also in Britain. So you're a couple of years behind us on this, but here's the first 3-way kidney exchange in Britain was reported in 2009. So there are some differences between how we work in the US and Britain. I'm going to tell you about those because what I want to tell you about is still more complicated kinds of exchanges that have become increasingly important and in the United States are now accounting for the majority of the transplants that we do through kidney exchange. So here's another stylized view of a compatibility graph, right? This is a little data set, a picture of a data set, if you like, in which each circle represents a patient-donor pair, and there's an arrow between one pair and the next if the kidney from the first pair can go into the patient in the second pair. And what you see here is that with this compatibility graph, it's possible to do some two-way exchanges. Here's a two-way exchange. It's possible to do a three-way exchange. And there's also this chain hanging out. And the chain begins, so not a cycle, but a chain. The chain begins with a non-directed donor. Now, most deceased donors in the United States are non-directed. That is, if you register to be a donor in case of your death in a way that allows you to, in case you die in a way that allows your organs to be donated, the law does not require, but because everything happens very fast, almost 100% of those are non-directed donors. They go to whoever is on the waiting list in the right position at the time of the death. But living donors are mostly directed. That is, mostly if you feel moved to give someone a kidney, it will be someone who you love. But there's an increasing number of non-directed donors. And they turn out to be very important because they really solve this double coincidence problem or triple coincidence problem. They don't come with a donor a patient of their own, so they can be involved in an exchange that doesn't come back and make full circle. Okay, and that's going to turn out to open up lots of possibilities. But I want to tell you about how we came to understand those possibilities, which was actually a very controversial thing in the American medical community, and why they are as important as they are. So to do that, I have to tell you a little bit about why someone can take your kidney and why they can't take your kidney. Okay, so bear with me and I'll give you, Kidneys 101. So there are 2 blood proteins that determine your blood type, A or B. And there are 4 blood types, therefore. If you have just the protein A, you're blood type A. If you have just the protein B, you're type B. If you have both, you're type AB. And if you have none of those proteins, you're type, in English, in America at least, we say type O. But there are many languages in which you say type 0, which is clearer because what it means is you don't have any of the blood proteins. And the rule about giving a kidney in terms of blood type compatibility is you cannot take a kidney from someone who has a blood protein that you do not have. So if you are an O donor, you can give a kidney to anyone. Any blood type can give a kidney to the same blood type, but O's can also give to A's because they don't have A protein. They don't have B protein. They can give to B's because they don't have A protein. And they can give to AB's because they don't have A or B protein. A's can give to themselves or AB's, but they can't give to B's. B's can give to other B's or to AB's. So O donors are quite valuable. They can give to anyone. And O patients are quite vulnerable. They need O kidneys. They can only take O kidneys. Now, mostly the kidney exchanges I'm going to be telling you about involve incompatible patient-donor pairs. So the only time, for today's talk, the only time that we're going to see pairs in kidney exchange are if the patient and the donor are not compatible. So the question is, why will we ever see any O donors? And the reason is it's not just blood type compatibility that is required before you can take someone's kidney. You also have to be what's called tissue type compatible. So if I didn't know my own blood type, the random draw on it would be such that each of you could take my kidney with a probability a little over 50%. But it turns out that my wife would only be able to take my kidney with a probability of about 30%. And that's because my wife and I are parents. And in the course of childbirth, her immune system might have become exposed to some of the proteins that our boys inherit from me and not from her. And if her immune system became exposed in the right way, in childbirth, not in pregnancy, but in childbirth, then her immune system might have developed antibodies to some of those proteins that our boys inherit from me. And if so, she would have antibodies waiting to attack my kidney, those proteins in my kidney, if it should show up in her body. And that would mean that she and I were tissue type incompatible. I couldn't give her a kidney. I could be healthy enough to give a kidney. I could give one of you a kidney. I could be blood type compatible with my wife. I could have type O blood. I don't. But I could still be incompatible because of those antibodies. So the way we're going to see O-type donors with incompatible patient-donor pairs is if they have this antibody, immune system incompatibility with their patient. And so you need to take a kidney from someone, you need to have compatible blood types and not have any antibodies to their proteins. So when kidney exchange was new, we were the only game in town. We set up some kidney exchanges, and we expected and got, for the first couple of years, we got a sort of representative sample of patients. So the representative sample of patients is, in the United States, we have not quite half blood type O. We have then blood type A, then blood type B, and blood type AB is about 4%. So we were seeing very few O patients, but when they had, O donors, they were going to be rare because they're mostly compatible with their patients, but we saw some because when patients have a lot of antibodies, they can't take a kidney necessarily even from an O donor. So when the pool of incompatible patient pairs looks like the general population, there's only a few people who have lots of antibodies. Only about 10% of the patients are what are called highly sensitized, have lots of antibodies, so it's hard to give them a kidney that's blood type compatible. And when that's the case, you can talk about, as the market gets large, we can tell you what an efficient exchange will look like. So here's a complicated picture. Let me take a moment explaining it to you. In each box here, this isn't the compatibility graph, this is a sort of a macro picture of the kidney pool. In each box, there's a patient-donor pair. So when it says OO, what it means is the patients in this box are type O, and the donors are type O. When it says ABO, it means the patients have blood type AB, and the donors have blood type O. There aren't going to be many of these guys because there aren't many people with AB, and mostly they can take O kidneys. So there'll just be few people in this box because the only way you're incompatible with your O donor is through tissue type, through antibodies. So the shaded nodes are the types that are going to be in short supply. They're going to be over-demanded. After every efficient allocation, after you give as many transplants as you can, there isn't going to be anybody left in the shaded boxes in an idealized world where there aren't too many antibodies, so when the market gets large, everyone can find a kidney that they can take. That doesn't mean that everyone will get transplanted, because let's look at who's in short supply. So here's an A patient with an O donor. So the O donor, they're in short supply. It's going to be easy to find a match for an O donor. And an A patient, if he's not too highly sensitized, there's plenty of A kidneys. Okay? On the other hand, who's left over after we've matched everyone we can? Well, here's, how are we going to match the AOs? We're going to pair them up with OAs. And here, these are patients with blood type O. These are the hardest to match patients. They have to have an O kidney. But their donor is nothing special. He's got blood type A, which is neither very rare nor very common. So the guys who are left over need a harder to get kidney than they're offering in exchange. And the guys who are going to be used up are offering a harder to get kidney than they need in exchange. Okay, so when we finished in a large market in a somewhat idealized world, the people who are left over are going to be the O patients who don't have O donors. Things like that. Okay, so let's think about chains, because what I want to tell you about is this picture. What's going to be the use of chains? And if we were seeing large markets of not too highly sensitized patients, chains wouldn't be very useful. Let's see why in this theory that I'm about to present to you, this is counterindicated by the facts, so we're going to have to figure out why that's true. But in this theory that I'm about to tell you, chains wouldn't be very important. Let's see why not. Well, supposing we got a chain started by a non-directed donor, and let's give ourselves the most valuable kind of non-directed donor, the easiest to match, someone with blood type O. So he can give his O-type kidney to an O patient, the hardest to match patients. So he gives to an O patient. He gives to this O patient who has an A donor. There are plenty of them left. These guys are left over after we've matched everyone we can. And then what can they do? They can pass it along. They can give to this A donor can give to this A patient. Now this AB donor can't give to anyone because every AB incompatible patient has already been matched, right? Because the AB patients are the easiest to match. They can take a kidney from anyone. And they therefore have donors who are harder to match. They were easy to make exchanges for. So there are no more AB patients left in the pool after we've done all the matches we can who need this donor. But he can still give a kidney to someone on the deceased donor waiting list, because there are 100,000 people on the deceased donor waiting list right now in the United States. 4% of them have blood type AB. There's plenty of people with blood type AB. So this is a great thing. This guy has come along and he said, I want to give a kidney. And in fact, he's caused 1, 2, 3 transplants to happen. Okay? So that would be great. But we're seeing chains that are much longer than that. And the question is that a mistake or not? When I say much longer, here's a chain with 60 people in it. Okay, that's 30 nephrectomies and 30 transplants. And what I want you to be worrying about at this point is this could be a publicity stunt that isn't doing any good to patients, and maybe it's even doing harm. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at this simple picture again. How many transplants can I get out of this little compatibility graph? I can get 2 here and 3 here, that's 5, and then I can do 6, 7, and I'm done. Now, that's a very short chain. He gives a transplant, he gives a transplant, and then this guy, I could get an 8th one. He could give to someone on the deceased donor list, not in the picture. Of course, I could have a longer chain. I could have this chain, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That looks good, except it exhausts all the transplants I can do, because pair 3 is in this chain, and now pair 1 and pair 2 won't get a transplant because they can't trade with each other. They needed to do a 3-way exchange with pair 3 in order to get transplanted. So it's possible that I could have a long chain that's a publicity stunt and actually harms patients, right? It causes me to get 5 transplants instead of 7 or 8. Okay? It's also possible that I could do a long chain that that consists of transplants that could have been done with shorter cycles and chains. Okay? So I want to argue that, in fact, that's not the case. But this took some time. This took some years in understanding in the American kidney exchange community. So I'm going to argue that, in fact, this kind of long chain is actually a really good thing. And it turns out to be the only way that very highly sensitized patients can get kidneys. And it turns out that our pool of patient donor pairs no longer looks like the general kidney disease population. It now looks very much more highly sensitized. And that's going to have to do with real economics, because it's going to turn out that when we started kidney exchange, you couldn't do kidney exchange except coming through one of the kidney exchange networks. But in the intervening years, kidney exchange has become a standard American transplant practice. And what that now means is you can free ride against it. You can free ride on it. And so if you're a big transplant center, you can choose to match your easy-to-match pairs internally. Just do the surgeries in your own hospital, and only send to the kidney exchange your hard-to-match pairs. And what that means is the pairs that start coming to kidney exchange are going to get more and more sensitized, and that the graph, those compatibility graphs, instead of being densely connected where you can get these efficient exchanges, they're going to become very sparse. And in very sparse graphs, what it means to be a very sparse graph is there aren't going to be a lot of arrows going around, and so there aren't going to be many short cycles. And it's going to be those chains that are going to save the day for us. So let me tell you about that. So to do that, I have to take you back before we had kidney exchange. And there were non-directed donors. Incidentally, a non-directed donor, like any donor, goes through a lot of screens before being accepted as a donor. Physiological screens: can you give away a kidney? Do you have 2 kidneys? And psychological screens: what's going on? Why do you want to give a kidney to a stranger? But you can pass through those screens, and if you do, what we used to say to non-directed donors is, you could save someone's life. Why don't we direct your kidney to a patient who has been on the waiting list for a long time, becoming more and more ill as they tolerate dialysis less and less well, and you'll save their life. But now that there's a kidney exchange pool of people waiting for the possibility of exchange to come up, we can offer a more attractive option to a non-directed donor, to someone who's moved to save someone else's life. We can say, you can save a number of lives, because you could give your kidney to the donor in an incompatible patient-donor pair, and they would pass it forward to, you could give it to the patient in an incompatible patient-donor pair, and the donor in that pair would pass it forward to another incompatible patient-donor pair, and the donor in that pair would give it to a patient on the waiting list who'd been waiting for a long time and was very ill. So instead of 1 transplant, you're causing 3 transplants. Okay, so that's a more attractive prospect, and of course this is an abstract picture. This is what it looks like when you get a reunion of the chain and you write a news story about it. And so the question that's the subject of my talk today, and the recent market design we've been doing, is why are there only 6 people in this picture? And the reason there are only 6 people in this picture is when this was done in 2007, we were doing all those transplants simultaneously, and all we could get going was 3 operating rooms for the nephrectomies and 3 operating rooms for the transplants. So that was as big as we could handle, our logistics. But the question is, this is a chain, not a cycle. And so do we have to do them all simultaneously? Because if we don't have to do them all simultaneously, then we could do more transplants. We could reuse the same surgical teams and operating rooms by doing some exchanges today and some tomorrow. So let's go over the reason that we used to and still do simple exchanges simultaneously, and see whether those reasons apply equally well to whether we should do chains simultaneously. Oh, incidentally, here in Britain, you still do short simultaneous chains. Okay, so if I could give advice to the Blood and Transplant Authority in England, I would tell them the kind of thing I'm going to tell you about why it's really a good idea to allow potentially long chains. Okay, so here's a standard 2-pair exchange that I want to tell you about. We always do these simultaneously. But let's suppose we didn't. Let's understand why we always do them simultaneously by seeing what could go wrong. What would be the cost of doing them sequentially? So suppose we plan this exchange and we say on day 1, donor 2 will give a kidney to recipient 1. And on day 2, donor 1 will give a kidney to recipient 2. That's the plan. And the plan works well on day 1, and donor 2 successfully gives a kidney to recipient 1. So donor 2 no longer has a kidney. And then on day 2, something goes wrong, and donor 1 fails to give a kidney to recipient 2. So pair 2, donor 2 and recipient 2, they have been very seriously harmed. First, they've had a surgery that they didn't need and didn't get any benefit from. But even worse than that, they no longer have a kidney to participate in kidney exchange with. So when we run another kidney exchange next week, they won't be there because they don't have a kidney. So that would be really a tragic harm to them. So we never let that happen. We always do those simultaneously. Right? The cost of a broken link would be too high to bear. But now let's suppose that we have a live non-directed donor, a living non-directed donor. So now we have, and let's say we do this sequentially, not simultaneously. In the picture that I showed you, we were doing them simultaneously. But suppose we don't. Well, on day 1, the living non-directed donor successfully gives a kidney to recipient 1. And on day 2, for whatever reason, whatever the reason was here, it happens here too, donor 1 fails to give a kidney to recipient 2. Well, that's very disappointing, right? Pair 2 is quite disappointed. But they haven't given a kidney yet. They're no worse off than they were before this living non-directed donor showed up. And so in particular, next week when we run another kidney exchange, they'll be right there looking for an exchange. They're disappointed, but they're not grievously harmed. And so now we can consider whether the benefits of having a long chain might be worth the reduced cost. It's a cost-benefit analysis. We say the cost is less, maybe the benefits are worth it. And I've already suggested to you that the benefits might be worth it, right? I showed you this big picture. So what I have to further convince you is that this is really a benefit and that these are extra guys getting transplants who wouldn't otherwise have gotten transplants, as opposed to a giant exchange that is superfluous. Okay, so we can, the cost of a broken link is not so great anymore. What could the benefits be? So incidentally, the first non-simultaneous chain was organized by the surgeon who was in Toledo, Ohio, the one at the other end of the phone. His name's Mike Reese. He's one of the heroes of this story. This is a funny kind of paper because the surgeons of all the patients are authors, but so are a bunch of economists and computer scientists. And what it reports is the first non-simultaneous chain. And here's a picture of it. There are 20 people in that picture. Here's a better picture with the people. 10 nephrectomies and 10 transplants. So right at the beginning, you could see that the potential benefits were big. This is the very first one. Instead of getting 3 transplants, we got 10. And at the time the article went to press, the chain hadn't ended. There was an AB donor who allowed us to use her name. Her name is Helena McKinney. And it took a long time. We try to no longer end chains with AB donors. If we have an AB donor at the end, we have her give a kidney to someone on the deceased donor waiting list. Because for the reasons I described, AB donors are rarely incompatible. They're rare in the population. So it actually took 3 years before we found an appropriate donor for her, and the chain continued. She got the call 3 years later, and she said, sure, a deal's a deal, and kept the chain going. So there's something interesting going there, too. It'd be easy to make a model of people that said, once your partner had gotten a kidney, you'd never go ahead. There's no contract. You can't be forced to give a kidney. Turns out we get very few renege, something on the order of 2%. So people are nicer than we sometimes give them credit for being when we model them as, in economic models. So here's that chain. And as you've seen, there are longer chains still. So we're seeing long chains, but I still haven't convinced you. I've set up the problem, so you should be worried that maybe this long chain wasn't necessary. Maybe you could have done it in a bunch of short cycles. So let me tell you why it's necessary. So right now, the data we're getting are that the compatibility graphs are very sparse. That is, the patients are highly sensitized. In the general patient population, there's a measure of how highly sensitized you are, how many people you'd be incompatible with, even if you were blood type compatible. It's called the PRA, the panel reactive antibodies. And in the general population, there are only 10% of the patients who have a PRA of greater than 80%. That means they can only take 20% of the compatible, blood type compatible kidneys. We're seeing well over half of our current patient pool has these very high rates, and in fact, some of them are very, very highly sensitized. We have a lot of people who have PRAs of over 95%. That means it's just very rare that you can find a kidney for them. So here's a picture, a snapshot of a piece of a data set from the Alliance for Paired Donation, one of the kidney exchanges that my colleagues and I have worked to organize. And this is a compatibility graph, so each circle represents a patient-donor pair, and each arrow represents a compatible kidney that could be transplanted. And everyone in this particular picture is chosen so that they all have blood type A. All the patients have blood type A, and all the donors have blood type A. So there are no blood type incompatibilities. every patient is blood type compatible with every donor. But what you see is there's just 8 pairs where there are a lot of arrows going in. Those guys are not so highly sensitized. They can take lots of these kidneys because they're all blood type A, which is just what they need. Everyone else has very few arrows going in. There are some patients who have no arrows going in, and they're not in this picture at all. Right? So everyone here could get a kidney from someone, but many of them can't get many kidneys at all. So let me reorient this graph for you. Suppose you could pick it up in your hand and shake it, and it was made of, corks and string or something. What you'd get is something like this jellyfish. You pick it up in your hand, and you're picking up the blue ones, the ones who have a lot of arrows. They can take lots of kidneys. They can, I'm a blood type A patient. I'm not very highly sensitized. You guys are all blood type A. Half of you are donors, half of you are patients. I'm not very highly sensitized at all. I can take everyone's kidney, all the donors, right? But there's only 8 of us, and we're the only ones who can be in cycles. So what you've got is this jellyfish. At the top are these low sensitized patients and a densely connected graph. Those guys can take kidneys from each other easily. We can easily get them in short exchanges. When I showed you the picture of what an efficient exchange would look like, what I observed was that mostly these guys could get transplanted in 2-way exchanges. Every now and then we'd need a 3-way exchange. Right? But the AAs in particular, the AAs, we could get them all in 2-way exchanges. But there's only a few of those guys who can take lots of kidneys just because they're blood type A. And the rest of this graph, sometimes they can give a kidney to someone, sometimes they can get a kidney from someone, but not the same people. So they're not in any short cycle. Instead, they're in these chains that are hanging down. Those are the highly sensitized patients. And so you can't get them in cycles. What you need is a non-directed donor who can come along and make a chain. Now, the jellyfish isn't actually a great model of what the chains would look like. Here's a better model. When we now model the patient-donor pool, we say there are 2 kinds of patients. There are low-sensitized patients and high-sensitized patients. The low-sensitized patients can take lots of kidneys. There are lots of arrows going in, including, I've left these out of the picture, arrows at the top of the jellyfish that go back and forth to each other. The reason I've left those out is it would be a shame to transplant an easy-to-match pair with another easy-to-match pair, because that leaves the hard-to-match pairs without anyone to match with. So when you have an easy-to-match pair, if it can give a kidney to a hard-to-match pair, sometimes it can take it back, and you can get them in some short cycles. But you can also construct chains that go back and forth. And so those long chains that I show you, they've got lots of very highly sensitized people in them, people who are never going to be part of a short exchange. And that's why the long chains are important, and they're important for the most vulnerable patients. So why do we have those sparse graphs? Why are there only 8 guys in Mike Reese's database at any one time of 8 AA patients who can take lots of kidneys? The reason is if you're a big transplant center and you've got 2 pairs of incompatible patient-donor pairs, both with blood type A, why are they incompatible? Well, they're incompatible maybe because of a pregnancy. If my wife is incompatible to me because of a pregnancy, she's not very highly sensitized. She won't be incompatible with you. She wasn't very sick. She didn't previously reject a kidney. She didn't have a lot of blood transfusions. It's sort of an accident that she's sensitized to me. So if you're a couple in the same circumstance, we can just do a trade. So what we're seeing is the hospitals are taking their easy-to-match pairs and keeping them out of the market. They're matching them to each other, which is, of course, inefficient because they could have been matched. Each of those easy-to-match pairs could have been matched with a hard-to-match pair. So we're seeing too few easy-to-match pairs. So we'd like to encourage full participation, and we think we know how to do it. We've been looking at these models and we've been looking at the data. And the way you do it is by having some kind of frequent flyer program for hospitals. You would say, if you send us some easy-to-match patients, we can pay you back. How would we pay you back? We, of course, can't pay you money. That's a felony in the United States. Well, remember, there's lots of patients left over after we've done all the transplants we can. Which patients are left over? They're the blood type O patients who have A donors. So we're going to end every chain eventually by saying we'll end it with someone who's otherwise unmatched or with someone who's on the waiting list. Many of these patients are also on the waiting list. So we can say we'll end a chain. If you send us easy to match pairs, we'll end more chains in your hospital. We'll end them with your hard to match patients, because at the end of every chain can be a hard to match patient who's on the waiting list. But right now, that's a political fight that we haven't won, because our medical colleagues say, well, they like to think, they come from a medical culture in which they say, you know, we only consider medical criteria in deciding who gets a kidney. And that's not a medical criterion, what hospital you came from and whether they've been good for the system. So that's a battle we haven't yet won. We've won many battles. You know, the kidney exchange has become a standard form of transplantation in the United States, but that one we're still working on. We already do this a little bit with non-directed donors. There's a big temptation if someone comes to your hospital and says, I'd like to give someone a kidney, to say to him, that's great, why don't you give a kidney to one of our patients? And what we'd like you to do is say, you could start a long chain that would save a lot of people. Let us enroll you in a kidney exchange. And in return, if your hospital introduces us to a non-directed donor, we'll remember that and we'll end chains at your hospital. Not necessarily the chain that your donor starts, because we ship kidneys across the country now. So if your chain ends in California, the last donation will be made in California. But we'll remember that we owe you one. And in that way, we actually take care of the incentive problem for non-directed donors. But we haven't yet won the political battles that will allow us to do it for other pairs. So one of the things that's happened, and this is a commonplace in market design, so I'm trying to tell you some general market design things along with the particular ones, is the market changes as it develops. The environment in which we were working when we began was that there was no kidney exchange. So we had to make sure that we gave patients and their surgeons the incentive to enroll. And we did that in various ways by making it, by having algorithms for matching kidneys that made it a dominant strategy for patients and their surgeons to reveal to us their necessary information. For example, how many donors they have, right? Supposing you have kidney disease, so you're feeling bad, and at some point you go to the doctor and they say, actually got very bad news, your kidneys are failing, you're going to need a transplant. You can stay alive for a while on dialysis, but you need a transplant. But don't lose hope, you can get a transplant from someone who loves you. So you go home and, at family dinner you say, I got this really bad news. But your brother and sister who love you, they jump up and say, not to worry, let's get tested. You can have one of our kidneys. And they get tested, and it turns out they're both compatible. So you've got, well, no, they're not both compatible. Neither is compatible, but they're both willing. So you have two incompatible donors. We would like you to come forward with those, because when we draw the compatibility graph, there will be a lot more arrows going out from your circle if your brother and sister are both with you. Only one of them will give a kidney. But if you exchange with me and my wife, maybe we'll get your brother's kidney. And if you exchange with someone else, maybe they'll get your sister's kidney. But supposing we organized the trade, so we said, people, with a lot of people who love them, they're already pretty lucky. Let's give priority to kidney patients who have only a single incompatible donor instead of patients who have two. Well, of course, then we'd never see any patients with two donors, right? You'd say to your brother and sister, listen, it's great that you're both willing to come in to kidney exchange with me, but they actually disadvantage people who come with two donors. Let's flip a coin. One of you will come with me, and if that doesn't work, then later I'll come with the other one. But let's not reveal that I have two donors, because they discriminate against people with two donors. So you could imagine that we could do something really silly like that and lose a lot of transplants. So you have to think about the incentives of the players. Well, when we began, the strategic players were the patients and their surgeons. But today, the strategic players are the directors of transplant centers. And directors of transplant centers have different strategies, because they don't see a single patient, they see lots of patients and donors. And right now, among their strategies is to withhold some of them and transplant them themselves. So that's what we're seeing. And the big issue, therefore, is that blood type compatibility is no longer the most important incompatibility that we're seeing in kidney exchange. Antibodies, tissue type compatibility is. And that the pool of incompatible patient-donor pairs no longer looks like the general pool, but it's much more highly sensitized. And that's why these long chains have become very important. And more than half the people in this chain, more than half the transplants, are very highly sensitized patients who could not have gotten a kidney any other way. Although, if the easy-to-match pairs had been in the pool, perhaps they could have gotten a kidney, because what we're doing is we're looking at that jellyfish. There's the easy-to-match guys on top and the hard-to-match guys, and because of the current incentives, the easy-to-match guys are being withheld from exchange, which means they're being matched to each other, leaving us to match the hard-to-match guys, which we can do, it turns out. It's a great thing, but we need long chains. Okay, so that's the story on long chains. So there aren't enough kidneys. The point of kidney exchange is to get more live donor kidneys into the population so we can do more transplants. So we can ask, why don't we just buy and sell kidneys? I had coffee with Gary Becker last week. Gary Becker is a famous economist at the University of Chicago. It's very cold right now in Chicago, so in fact he's at Stanford for the quarter. And not many weeks ago, he had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying it's time to pay cash for kidneys. And he's had these op-eds over the years. I'm going to tell you about an article that I wrote in 2007 in the Journal of Economic Perspectives on repugnant transactions. He had an article in the same issue on why don't we buy and sell kidneys. He estimates that the market clearing price would be quite low. He estimates it would be $15,000 in the United States. The way he estimates this is by looking at the risk to the donors and looking at the general labor market, at the wage premium for risky jobs like being a coal miner. And he calculates that if donors demanded the same kind of risk premium that coal miners do, then kidneys would be very cheap because there are lots and lots of kidneys. But it's against the law everywhere in the world except the Islamic Republic of Iran to buy and sell kidneys. So there's a social science phenomenon that we have to understand. And what I said to Gary is, if you want to change the existing law, it probably would be worthwhile to understand, it's not just against the law in the United States, it's against the law everywhere. There's something going on that as social scientists we should understand better. So I don't know the answer to this. I'm not going to tell you today whether we should have a market for kidneys, and if so, how we should regulate it, whether only the federal government should be allowed to buy kidneys and they should distribute them the way they do now so that we don't have a world in which only the rich can have kidney transplants, things like that. If you wanted to talk about a cash market for kidneys, you should talk to a market designer and we'd think about how to run it so that we'd like it. But that's not my subject today. My subject is why is it that, and what else is it that we don't like when it comes to markets? And this is particularly because making markets illegal doesn't make them go away, right? So there are illegal markets for kidneys, just as there are illegal markets for narcotics and prostitution and all sorts of things that we make laws against so that there aren't legal markets for. So I did a search for kidney and illegal in The Guardian and The Telegraph. And I came up with some stories that say, Britain's being sold illegal kidneys for surgery in Sri Lanka, for instance. So it's illegal in Britain to buy or sell a kidney, but of course, that doesn't mean that no British people want to buy kidneys and doesn't mean that no people want to sell them kidneys. 2 Britons held in Delhi over illegal kidney transplant. Illegal kidney trade booms as new organ is sold every hour, said The Guardian in 2012. Needless to say, it's a little hard to gather data on these illegal markets, but making a market illegal doesn't make it go away, and it might make it operate pretty badly. So let's talk about repugnance. And when I say a transaction is repugnant, I mean that it's a transaction that some people would like to do and other people think they shouldn't do. Okay, so buying and selling kidneys is a repugnant transaction in the sense that some people would like to buy kidneys, some people would be happy to sell their kidneys. We see this because there are black markets where they do, but it's against the law in Britain. It's against the law in the United States. It's against the law just about everywhere. But it's not the only thing that's against the law. So if we're going to try to understand this, we have to start to think about what else don't we like to buy and sell. And of course, markets are sort of social institutions. They need a lot of buy-in to work well. So we have to think about that. So let me suggest to you that repugnant transactions have been of first-order importance in economics over the years. So for example, for a couple of hundred years in the Middle Ages, it was charging interest on loans was a repugnant transaction. The medieval church thought that there was something wrong with making money from your money. Okay, but today you can see ads for retirement funds that say, make your money work for you. Invest it so that you'll have more money when you're old. And of course, we couldn't have capitalism as we know it if we didn't have a market for capital. So there's a big change in the organization of the world economy that came about by interest becoming a less repugnant transaction. But it's not the case that, well, take same-sex marriage. There's a good one. In the United States, we now have 16 states that allow same-sex marriage. So this is in flux. We have a somewhat larger number of states that have passed constitutional amendments to their state constitution saying that marriage must be between a man and a woman. So Americans are very divided on this question. And I think of it as a prototypical repugnant transaction because it's a transaction that some people want to do. They want to marry each other, and other people don't think they should be allowed to. Right? So it's a repugnant transaction not because not everyone wants to marry someone of the same sex. That's not the issue. It's that you might want to marry someone of the same sex, and I might think you shouldn't, and I might be able to get my state legislature to pass an amendment against it, or we might get them to repeal an old law against it. So the arrow of time doesn't point just in one direction, though. It's not that as we get more modern, things used to be repugnant and now they're not, because in the United States we used to sell slaves. And the most common way for people to buy passage across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1700s to get to America was to sign articles of indenture. So you'd approach some ship captain and you'd say, "Can you take me to Boston?" And he'd say, "It's expensive." And you'd say, "I don't have the money." Say, "Not a problem. Sign this contract, voluntarily entered into, and when we get to Boston, I will sell your unconditional labor for 5 years to the highest bidder in Boston Harbor. And you voluntarily entered into this, but you will be without recourse. You will work for this person for 5 years until your indenture is over." Well, that was the most common way to buy passage across the Atlantic Ocean from England to America. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution says we're not going to do that anymore. That's illegal in the United States. So that's a contract that used to not be so repugnant, but is now repugnant and illegal by constitutional amendment. Okay, so that's a market that you could imagine we'd say it's real asymmetric information, power differences. We're going to regulate it. That's not what we said. We said we're not going to have it. That doesn't mean we don't have it. Illegal immigration to the United States is sometimes organized by people who bring people into the United States and then require them to pay off debts. And because they're undocumented, they can't go to the police and complain about their working conditions, and they're indentured servitudes. They're indentured servants. They have to work without recourse until this debt is paid off. So the arrow of time points in both ways. Some things get less repugnant over time, but some things get more repugnant. Here in Britain, apparently, same-sex marriage is controversial. Here's a headline that says high-ranking conservatives, back gay marriage, and here's another one that says more than half of conservative parliamentary party declined to support the prime minister on this issue. So in England, as in the United States, people have different views on this. So let's talk about other repugnant transactions. One of the things about repugnant transactions that's going to make them hard to understand is they're not universal. There are things repugnant in some places and not in others, just as there are things repugnant at some times and not in others. So this morning when I woke up, I pointed my browser at the New York Times, and because of the 10-hour time difference I was to California, I was pointing at yesterday's New York Times, and there was this great story. This is from my blog. I have a market design blog. And there's on the front page of the internet version of the New York Times, when I turned it on, there was a story about a same-sex marriage couple, 2 men, one of whom is a state senator in New York, who are raising a child that they caused to be born through a gestational surrogacy in California, where they paid a woman to bear the child for them, not from her egg, but from an egg that they had arranged to get in some other way, along with their sperm. And there's a paid transaction, which is legal in California, but not in New York. And one of the husbands is a state senator, and he's proposing legislation to make it legal in New York, as it is in California. So there's a story with all these repugnant transactions there. They're a same-sex couple, they're legally married, they are purchasing reproductive services from a woman in California where such purchase is legal, and bringing the child to New York where such purchase is not legal, but it's their child. The California birth certificate lists them both as the father, and they're all set. The little girl looks very pretty, and they had a nice story about her. Apparently, she gets to go to lots of musicals. Here's the British Surrogacy Arrangement Act of 1985. It says, Article 2, negotiating surrogacy arrangements on a commercial basis. No person shall on a commercial basis do any of the following acts in the United Kingdom. That is, initiate or take part in any negotiations with a view to the making of a surrogacy arrangement. Offer or agree to negotiate the making. Compile and, says don't do it. It's illegal in Britain. It's not illegal in Britain, and it's not illegal in New York to bear a surrogate baby. It's illegal to be paid for it. Okay? Well, here's a headline from the Telegraph that says, revealed how more and more Britons are paying Indian women to become surrogate mothers. That is, there's fertility tourism, just as there's transplant tourism. British couples who wish to have children and can't on their own and wish to use a surrogate can come to the United States and do it. They can come to California. They can go to India. It's a big market in India. So once again, it's possible to make laws against markets without making the markets go away. So this question of repugnance, it really is. There are people who really want to do this on both sides of the market. It's illegal in Britain, but it doesn't mean that Britons aren't taking part in it. But it's not illegal in California, but it is illegal in New York, right? So these are things there's not going to be an evolutionary explanation for this. This is a new kind of market. It didn't used to exist. But we feel strongly about it. That is, you and I may have strong opinions about this, and they may be different from each other. And economists often feel less repugnance towards voluntary transactions than other people, but you should be aware that lots of people have feelings about transactions, what kind of markets we ought to allow. The title of my 2007 paper was Repugnance as a Constraint on Markets. And I think if we want to understand them, even if our goal is like Gary Becker to relax them, we had better understand what's going on. I think this is a social science issue that we have to understand. And some of these are really complex, but some of them are simple. Why can't you eat horse or dog meat in California? Well, the simple answer is it's against the law. But the reason it's against the law, this is not some ancient law that comes from the days when, the cowboy days when a horse was a man's best friend. This is a 1998 law that was passed by popular referendum. We have referenda in California. Enough petitions can put legislation on the ballot so that it's directly voted on. As many people voted to make it illegal, a felony, to sell horse meat for human consumption in California, as voted for the winning candidate for governor that year. Okay? Now let's think why there's a law against eating horse meat in California. Horse meat is eaten elsewhere, of course. You can eat horse meat in France. You can eat horse meat in Japan. You can eat horse meat at Tesco's. The reason there's a law against eating horse meat in California is not that no one in California wants to eat horse meat. There's no law in California against eating cockroaches, right? No one wants to eat cockroaches, but if you want to, go ahead. The reason there's a law against eating horse meat in California is some people want to eat horse meat and other people don't want them to, right? You don't make laws against things that no one is doing. So this is a repugnant transaction. Some people would like to eat horse meat. They come from places where horse meat is delicious, but they can't get it in California. It turns out you can't get it anywhere in the United States, although it's only illegal in California. Congress, the federal Congress, has tried on a number of occasions to make it illegal to eat horse meat in the United States without success, because ranching interests oppose cutting down on the uses for horses, which are economic assets if you're a rancher. But you can't eat any meat in the United States unless it's been inspected by the Department of Agriculture and found to be safe for human consumption. And Congress has withheld money from the Department of Agriculture to inspect horse meat. So there are no horse meat slaughterhouses in the United States. Horses that someone would like to slaughter and sell for meat are all shipped to Mexico and Canada, slaughtered and sold in Europe and Asia. Princess Anne thinks that you guys should eat more horse meat. How about dwarf tossing? Here's again an uncomplicated one. So here's the British dwarf tossing championship of 2002, when Jimmy Leonard of England, that's the big man, tossed Lenny the Giant 11 feet 5 inches. So here's Lenny the Giant. He's wearing a helmet. He's earning his living. He gets paid for this. He's a professional athlete who wears safety equipment and can fall gracefully, and there are people who would like to engage in this sport with him. Here's the Ontario Dwarf Tossing Ban Act of 2003. Okay, he can't do this in Ontario. He can do it in England, but he can't do it in Ontario. Notice this is not an Occupational Health and Safety Act. It doesn't say Lenny the Giant has to wear a helmet. Lenny the Giant is already wearing a helmet. It says, no person shall organize a dwarf tossing event or engage in dwarf tossing. It says, yuck, you shouldn't do that. Okay? A French dwarf, when dwarf tossing was banned in France, a French dwarf took his case to the UN High Commission on Human Rights. And he said that his rights were being violated by this law, which deprived him of his living. And France has a case, you read the case notes, and they say, it's necessary to ban the law. It's consistent with human rights because dwarf tossing is terrible. It's repugnant. He shouldn't be able to do it. And he has a very moving statement in the case notes. He says, there aren't a lot of jobs for dwarves in France. And the essence of human dignity is having a job. And this is my job. And I remember reading that and thinking, but France won. The UN committee found for France, I wonder how often the UN committee finds for individuals when they are suing states, saying that the ban on dwarf tossing was not abusive but necessary in order to protect public order, including considerations of human dignity. So what their statement went on to say is they say every time the French dwarf earned his living in this way, he was free riding on some quality that makes us all human and was making us all a little less human, and that therefore, because of this negative externality, it was okay to prevent him from earning his living in this way. So that's an interesting kind of negative externality. We know about negative externalities, but there's something a little different going on there. And it can be hard to figure out what it is. We don't mind watching small men ride big horses in races, right? Jockeys are small, but you can be a very highly paid jockey. Wife carrying is a sport you may not have heard of, but there's a world championship. These people are not married to each other. They're athletic teams, and it's not entirely dignified. Getting through the water course can be most people now use the Estonian position. The Finns are now the world champions, but it's hard for me to make a model in which dwarf tossing is repugnant and wife carrying is not. It seems to me in most of the models I could make they'd either both be on one side of the line or both be on the other side of the line. So this is going to be a hard thing to study because it's so different in time and place. But one thing I know is that, so I don't know what makes something repugnant, but one thing I observe is that sometimes something is not repugnant until you add money. Okay? So interest on loans. The medieval church didn't mind that you should make loans. They minded that you should get interest on it. Payments to birth mothers. It's expensive in the United States anyway to adopt a child, but you can't buy the child from the birth mother. You can't pay for the child. Prostitution is illegal in most of the United States, but promiscuity isn't. Right? It's the payment that we don't like. And so most people, here's a cartoon, and most people can identify who the economist is in this cartoon. The poor guy is showing up for dinner, and he says, we didn't have time to pick up a bottle of wine, but here's some cash, which is what we would have spent. So I include this to show you that even in a group of economists, all of you are going to find some repugnance at the use of money. Suppose you invite me to dinner at your house. I could bring an expensive bottle of wine. That would be gratefully received. What I can't do is after eating dinner at your house say, that was great. That would cost me at least 30 pounds at a nice restaurant. Can I just tuck that under the napkin? You'd say, what's the matter with this guy? We're not a restaurant. Dinner at our house isn't a financial transaction. We invite him as an act of friendship. He can invite us out to dinner at his house. He can invite us out to dinner at a restaurant. He can bring a fancy bottle of wine, but he certainly can't offer to pay. He's never going to be invited back. So even in a group of economists, we recognize that there are transactions that we wouldn't approve of money being offered. So there's a lot of arguments about this, and I'm running out of time, but the ones, some of them are hard for economists to understand. People talk about coercion. People might sell their kidneys just because they're offered so much money. Also, to economists, that sounds like an opportunity rather than like a coercion. But the slippery slope argument is, loosely speaking, says, maybe we could design a kidney market that would protect us against the worst abuses, against your bank wanting to foreclose on your kidney instead of your house when you can't pay your mortgage. But, it would be easy to make a law against that. It's against the law now. But maybe we would find ourselves slipping into a less sympathetic society than we would like to live in. And I think those are the arguments that I find easiest to understand, but I won't spend a lot of time on that. So let me get a sense of the meeting. How many of you are willing to contemplate carefully regulated sales of live kidneys? If you think that would be worth trying under careful regulation, put your hand up. Put it way up, because I have another question. Okay, so look around you. There's a bunch of hands up, by no means all, maybe half, maybe a little more than half in this group of economists. Keep them up. That's for kidneys. How about hearts? The seller dies. Right? There might be still a couple hands up at Chicago, a Chicago economist. Remember, there are people who commit life insurance fraud by buying life insurance and then committing suicide. They're trying to provide for their families, pay off their debts, and they're willing to do it, and it's fraud. If you buy life insurance with the intention of committing suicide, your insurance likely will not pay if they can show that. So it's not that there wouldn't be willing participants in a market for hearts, right? That's like life insurance, except you save a life instead of driving into a bridge. But a lot of people who had their hands up took their hands down, and I make that point because a lot of us have places where we take our hands down. So when you think about markets, remember that some people might put their hands up and take their hands down at a different place than you. But it's worth understanding what they're thinking about, because most of us take our hands down at some point. So we think there might be some limits to markets. It's extremely hard to say what they are. Michael Sandel doesn't have a clue. But the fact that his book about limits to markets and how some things should not be for sale is a popular book reflects the fact that, indeed, it's illegal to sell kidneys everywhere. There's something going on, and economists have been too long leaving that subject to non-economists because it's really important. One of the things that is seldom talked about when you talk about why you might not like a market for kidneys is the fact that there are 100,000 people in the United States waiting for a kidney right now as we speak, and many of them will die while they're waiting. So it's not that it's easy to dismiss the idea of a market, even if you find it repugnant. But some people do. And so we need to understand that, because interest on loans, slavery, lots of things we've changed our mind about over the years. And the nice thing about kidney exchange is it allows us to bring some of the benefits of a marketplace to kidney transplants without arousing that repugnance. And that's why my paper was called Repugnance as a Constraint on Market Design. Often we have to work within the constraints. And so kidney exchange, to my way of thinking about it, has been pretty successful at doing that, but I sure wish I understood the constraints better. Thank you.